I was never the type to splurge. Every penny I earned was carefully tucked away into my savings account, a growing pile of hope for the future. It wasn't easy. The sacrifices were countless. While my friends were out dining at trendy restaurants or planning spontaneous trips, I was at home, calculating budgets and clipping coupons. My dream was worth it. Every dollar meant I was one step closer to starting my own art studio, a passion I had nurtured since childhood. For years, that account had been my secret source of pride, until the day I found out it wasn't mine anymore. It started innocently enough. My mother was in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone while humming a cheerful tune. "Italy, can you believe it? After everything we've been through, we finally deserve a break," she exclaimed, glancing at my father, who nodded with a satisfied grin. I froze mid-step. Curiosity piqued. Italy? A vacation? I hadn't heard anything about this. "Wait, what's this about Italy?" I asked, stepping into the room. My mother's expression faltered, just for a moment, before she plastered on a casual smile. "Oh, just something your father and I have been planning for a while," she replied, her voice light. "A little getaway." "That sounds amazing," I said, though my stomach churned. "How are you affording it?" The silence that followed was deafening. My father suddenly found great interest in his coffee mug, and my mother busied herself with rearranging the silverware drawer. My heart started pounding. I knew that silence. It was the kind that came right before an unpleasant truth. "Mom, Dad, how are you paying for it?" I pressed, my voice sharper now. My mother sighed, finally meeting my gaze. "We use the savings account." At first, the words didn't register. The savings account? My savings account? A laugh bubbled up in my throat, disbelief masking the rage that was building like a tidal wave. "You're joking, right?" "Don't overreact," my father muttered. "It's not like you were using it right now. We'll pay you back." Pay me back. The audacity of those words made my head spin. This wasn't some spare change they'd borrowed for groceries or a quick fix. This was years of my hard work, my dreams, my sacrifices, all gone, just like that. And for what? A vacation I hadn't even been invited to? "I can't believe this," I said, my voice shaking. "That money wasn't for you to take. It was for my future, for the business I've been planning for years. Do you even realize what you've done?" "Oh, come on," my mother said dismissively, her tone grating. "It's not like we didn't need it. We've been through so much stress, and this trip will help us reset as a family. You should be happy for us." "Happy for you?" I repeated, incredulous. "You stole from me, and now you're telling me I should be happy about it?" My father finally spoke up, his voice laced with irritation. "You're making a big deal out of nothing. This is for the family, not just us. And besides, you're young. You'll earn it back." The words hit me like a slap. I wasn't even sure what hurt more, the betrayal or the utter lack of remorse. I stormed out of the room, my chest heaving with anger and despair. Upstairs in my room, I sat on my bed, staring blankly at the wall. My mind raced, jumping from disbelief to fury to a cold, calculating clarity. If they thought they could take what was mine without consequence, they were in for a rude awakening. I didn't have a plan yet, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. For days, I couldn't shake the gnawing anger that had settled deep in my chest. Every time I heard my parents excitedly discussing their itinerary, Rome, Venice, Florence, it felt like a fresh slap to the face. They moved around the house as though nothing had happened, as though stealing my hard-earned money and excluding me from their family vacation was perfectly reasonable. Each passing moment only solidified one thing in my mind. They had to be taught a lesson. Late one night, when the house was silent and my parents were fast asleep, I sat in my room and opened my laptop. My hands trembled as I logged into my savings account, half hoping to find some of the money still there. Maybe this was all just a misunderstanding. But when I saw the glaringly low balance, a mere fraction of what it had been, I knew there was no mistake. They had drained nearly all of it. I clenched my fists, my mind racing. They didn't just take the money. They took years of my life, the countless hours I spent working overtime, the opportunities I passed up so I could save for my future. And now, they expected me to sit idly by while they lived out their Italian fantasy? Number not a chance. My initial anger turned into a cold determination. If they thought I wasn't important enough to include in their trip, then they didn't deserve to go either. It was that simple. I began researching their flights, digging through travel confirmation emails they carelessly left open on the family computer. It wasn't hard to find the details: departure dates, airlines, booking numbers. They had no idea how much I had learned just by keeping my eyes open. With every click of my mouse, I felt a strange mix of guilt and satisfaction. I knew what I was about to do would escalate things, but the betrayal I felt overshadowed any second thoughts. My parents had taken something from me that wasn't theirs to take, and now I was reclaiming control, not just over my money, but over my dignity. The cancellation process was surprisingly simple. I followed the prompts on the airline's website, entered the booking number, and within minutes, their tickets were voided. My heart pounded as I stared at the confirmation screen. It was done. The power I felt in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. For once, I wasn't the one being taken advantage of. The next morning, I acted as though everything was normal. I made small talk over breakfast, even smiled when my mom mentioned how excited she was to see the Colosseum. They had no idea what was coming. As much as I wanted to see their reactions when they found out their tickets had been canceled, I knew it was better to play dumb. I didn't want them suspecting me right away. Later that day, while my parents were busy running errands, I confided in my best friend, Mia. She was the only person who truly understood how much this whole situation had hurt me. When I told her what I'd done, her eyes widened in shock. "You canceled their tickets?" she whispered, her voice a mix of disbelief and admiration. "Yeah," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "They deserve it." Mia hesitated. "I mean, I get it. They were awful to you, but don't you think this might make things worse?" "Maybe," I admitted, "but they need to know they can't just walk all over me. If I don't stand up for myself now, they'll keep doing it." Mia nodded slowly. "Just be careful, okay? This could blow up in ways you don't expect." Her words lingered in my mind long after she left, but I couldn't bring myself to regret my decision. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For the first time in days, I wasn't consumed by anger or despair. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: control. But little did I know, the storm I had just unleashed was only beginning. The fallout began the next morning. I was halfway through my breakfast when my parents burst through the front door, dragging their luggage behind them. The expression on my mother's face was somewhere between confusion and rage, while my father's lips were pressed into a tight line. I immediately knew they'd found out. "Unbelievable!" my mother shouted, slamming her bag down. "Do you know what we just went through at the airport?" I calmly looked up from my plate, feigning innocence. "Number. What happened?" "Our tickets," my father snapped, his face red with anger. "They were canceled, just canceled out of nowhere. The airline said someone voided the booking. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to keep a straight face. That's strange. Did you call customer service? Of course we did, my mother barked. They said someone used the confirmation number to cancel it online. Do you know how humiliating it was standing there while everyone stared at us like we were idiots? I shrugged, doing my best to appear nonchalant. Well, maybe there was some kind of error. You should check if it was a hacker or something. My mother narrowed her eyes at me, her gaze sharp and suspicious. You seem awfully calm about all this. I set my fork down and met her stare. What do you want me to do? Cry? It's not like I had anything to do with it. My father threw his hands up in frustration. This trip was supposed to be the one good thing we've had in years, and now it's ruined. Do you have any idea how much time and effort we put into planning this? The words were like a slap in the face. They had spent weeks planning this trip, using my money, but hadn't thought about including me for even a second. Their audacity only fueled my resolve to keep my secret. I'm sorry you're going through this, I said, forcing my voice to stay calm. But maybe this is a sign. You know, karma has a funny way of working. Karma? My mother hissed, her face turning pale. What are you saying? I'm just saying, I replied, standing up from the table. Maybe you should think about how your actions affect other people. Sometimes the universe has a way of balancing things out. The room fell silent, my words hanging in the air like an unspoken accusation. My parents exchanged glances, their suspicion growing. I could see the gears turning in their heads, but they couldn't outright accuse me without proof. Not yet anyway. For the next few days, the house was a minefield. My parents were constantly on edge, snapping at each other and grumbling about the canceled trip. They spent hours on the phone with the airline, trying to salvage what they could, but it was clear their vacation was over before it had even started. Meanwhile, I kept my head down, going about my routine as if nothing had happened. It was a delicate balancing act. One slip, and they would figure out the truth. But the stress was starting to wear on me. Every time my phone buzzed, I feared it was a call from the airline or some message that would blow my cover. Worse, the satisfaction I had felt was starting to wane, replaced by a gnawing guilt I couldn't ignore. As much as I believed they deserved what had happened, the tension in the house was becoming unbearable. Then, one evening, just as I thought I might get away with it, the game changed. My father called me into the living room, his face unusually calm. My mother sat beside him, her arms crossed, glaring at me. On the coffee table between them was a printout of the cancellation confirmation. My stomach dropped. "We need to talk," my father said, his voice dangerously steady. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "About what?" "About this," he said, tapping the paper. "The airline sent us this confirmation email. It's linked to our account, but the IP address isn't ours." My heart raced. I had been so careful, but clearly not careful enough. "And guess whose device it matches?" my mother added, her voice dripping with venom. My mind scrambled for a response, but before I could speak, my father leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "Did you do this? Did you cancel our tickets?" Every instinct told me to deny it, to keep up the facade, but I hesitated for just a fraction of a second, long enough for them to see the truth written all over my face. "You did, didn't you?" my mother said, her voice rising with disbelief. "You sabotaged us." And just like that, the carefully constructed wall I had built came crumbling down. The room was electric with tension, the air thick enough to cut. My father stared at me, his jaw tight, waiting for me to explain. My mother, on the other hand, was already pacing the room, muttering angrily under her breath. I could feel the weight of their fury pressing down on me, but there was no point in denying it now. They knew. "Yes," I finally said, my voice firm despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "I canceled your tickets." My mother froze mid-step, her eyes wide with disbelief. "How could you?" she hissed. "After everything we've done for you?" I couldn't help but laugh, a bitter, humorless sound that only seemed to fuel her anger. "Everything you've done for me? You mean like stealing my savings? Like planning a family trip to Italy and not even inviting me? Spare me the lecture, Mom." My father stood up, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "We're your parents. We had every right to use that money. You live under our roof, eat our food. That money wasn't yours," I snapped, cutting him off. "I worked for years to save that. It was supposed to be for my future, not for you to blow on some vacation." "We were going to pay you back," my mother said, her tone defensive now. "You didn't have to sabotage us like this. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it was to be stranded at the airport, treated like criminals?" "Good," I shot back. "Maybe now you'll know how it feels to have something stolen from you." For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioner. My parents looked at me as if they were seeing a stranger, and maybe they were. I wasn't the compliant, quiet kid they were used to. I was someone who had been pushed too far, and now I was pushing back. My father finally broke the silence, his voice cold. "You think you've won, don't you? But you're going to regret this. Mark my words." "Regret what?" I said, throwing my hands up. "Standing up for myself? For once in my life, I decided I wasn't going to let you walk all over me. And you know what? It feels good." My mother opened her mouth to respond, but my phone buzzed on the coffee table, cutting her off. I glanced at the screen and felt a pang of dread when I saw the notification. "Bank account access denied." "What's that?" my father asked, his tone almost gleeful. He could see the shift in my expression, and it gave him the upper hand. I grabbed my phone, my heart racing as I logged into my banking app. The message was clear: "Your account has been restricted. Please contact your branch for assistance." Panic set in. "What did you do?" I demanded, glaring at them. My father crossed his arms, a smug smile creeping onto his face. "You didn't think we'd just let this slide, did you? That account was in our names too. We had it frozen." My blood ran cold. They had just turned the tables, and now I was the one left scrambling. "You had no right," I shouted, clutching my phone like it was a lifeline. "Neither did you," my mother said, her voice eerily calm now. "You want to play this game? Fine. But you're going to learn that actions have consequences." I stormed out of the room, my mind racing. My savings were gone, my parents were furious, and now they had locked me out of the account I had poured my life into. For the first time, I wasn't sure if I'd gone too far, but one thing was clear: this wasn't over, not by a long shot. I sat in my room, staring blankly at the ceiling, my mind churning with anger and panic. How had it come to this? My parents had stolen from me, humiliated me, and now they'd frozen what little I had left. It felt like a game I couldn't win, a never-ending tug-of-war where they always held the upper hand. But giving up wasn't an option. If they thought they could bully me into submission, they were sorely mistaken. The first thing I did was call the bank. The representative's voice was polite but firm as she explained the situation. Since the account was technically a joint one, both account holders, my parents, had equal control over it. They had every right to freeze it, and there was nothing I could do without their consent. "Is there any way I can open a new account without them?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "Of course," the representative said, "but you'll need to transfer funds from the current account first." Funds I no longer had access to. I clenched my fist, thanked her, and hung up. My parents had me cornered. For now. I needed to think, and fast. Their smug faces flashed in my mind, the way they had acted so justified, so righteous in their betrayal. I wasn't just angry anymore, I was determined. If they wanted to play dirty, I could too. Over the next few days, I started gathering every scrap of evidence I could. I combed through old emails, bank statements, and transaction histories, documenting every cent I had deposited into that account. Late at night, when my parents were asleep, I'd sneak into the living room and take photos of receipts or financial documents they'd carelessly left lying around. I wanted proof. Proof that the money was mine, that I had earned it, and that they had stolen it. Meanwhile, the tension in the house was suffocating. My parents barely spoke to me, and when they did, it was curt and passive-aggressive. My mother would sigh dramatically whenever I walked into the room, and my father would mutter under his breath about ungrateful children. It was a toxic war of attrition, and neither side was willing to back down. Then, one afternoon, an unexpected opportunity presented itself. My father had left his laptop open on the dining table while he went out to the garage. Curious, I walked over and glanced at the screen. It was an email thread with their travel agent, something about rescheduling the trip. I scrolled down and found something that made my heart race: a refund confirmation. The airline had reimbursed them for the canceled tickets, and the money had gone straight into their personal account. My stomach churned with rage. Not only had they taken my savings, but they were now sitting on thousands of dollars from the refund, acting as if they were the victims in all this. I quickly snapped a photo of the screen before hearing my father's footsteps. I darted back to my room, adrenaline pumping. That night, I called Mia. She was the only person I could trust with what I'd discovered. "They got a refund?" she asked, her voice rising in disbelief. "And they didn't even tell you?" "Exactly," I said, pacing my room. "They're sitting on my money like it's theirs. This proves they're lying about everything." Mia hesitated. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," I admitted, running a hand through my hair. "But I can't let them get away with this." For the first time, I considered taking legal action. It sounded extreme, but I was running out of options. If they were willing to freeze my account and keep the refund money, what else were they capable of? They clearly didn't care about fairness or family loyalty. Maybe it was time I stopped caring too. I didn't know where this battle would end, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going down without a fight. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The idea of legal action lingered in my mind, but I knew it wasn't something to rush into. I needed more leverage, more evidence. My parents had underestimated me, and I was determined to make them realize they weren't invincible. Over breakfast, the silence in the house was heavier than ever. My mother sat scrolling on her phone, occasionally sipping her coffee, while my father read the paper, his expression unreadable. I wanted to confront them right then and there about the refund, but I knew better. Timing was everything. Instead, I decided to test the waters. "So," I said casually, stirring my oatmeal, "any updates on the trip? Did you manage to rebook?" My mother stiffened but didn't look up from her phone. My father folded the newspaper with deliberate slowness. "Not that it's any of your business," he said, his tone icy, "but we're figuring it out." "Oh, I see," I said, feigning disinterest. "I just thought it might be tricky without the refund money." That got their attention. My mother's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" I shrugged. keeping my tone light. "I saw the email. The airline refunded you, didn't they? Must be nice to have all that money back." The color drained from my mother's face, and my father's jaw tightened. They exchanged a quick glance, a silent conversation passing between them. For a moment, I almost felt bad for calling them out so bluntly. Almost. "What were you doing snooping through our emails?" my father demanded. "I wasn't snooping," I said, meeting his glare. "Your laptop was open. If you're going to leave things lying around, maybe don't act so surprised when people notice." My mother set her coffee cup down with a loud clink. "You have no right to accuse us of anything. That money belongs to the family. We're using it for all of us." "Funny," I said, crossing my arms, "because last I checked, I wasn't invited to Italy. How exactly is this for all of us?" The room fell silent again, the tension thick enough to cut. My parents were clearly caught off guard, but they weren't about to admit they were in the wrong. My father leaned back in his chair, his expression hard. "You need to drop this," he said. "Right now. What's done is done." "No," I said firmly. "What's done is theft. You took my savings, you froze my account, and now you're sitting on a refund that rightfully belongs to me. You can't just pretend this is okay." My mother looked at me with a mix of anger and something else. Fear, maybe. "And what are you going to do about it?" she asked, her voice sharp. I stood up, my heart pounding. "I don't know yet," I said honestly, "but I'll figure it out. And when I do, you're going to wish you'd handled this differently." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out of the room. My hands were shaking, but I felt a strange sense of power, too. For once, I wasn't letting them bulldoze me. That afternoon, I decided to visit a lawyer. I didn't know much about my rights, but I figured it was time to get professional advice. I explained everything: the stolen savings, the frozen account, the refund. The lawyer, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, listened carefully. "You have a strong case," she said after I finished. "If you can prove that the money was yours and that they used it without your consent, you could potentially take legal action to recover it." Her words filled me with hope, but they also terrified me. Taking my own parents to court felt like crossing a line I wasn't sure I could uncross. Still, the thought of letting them get away with everything was unbearable. "Think about it," she added, handing me her card. "You don't have to decide right now, but if you want to proceed, call me." That night, I sat in my room, staring at the lawyer's card. The decision weighed heavily on me. Was I really ready to take this fight to the next level? Or was there still a chance to resolve things without tearing my family apart completely? Either way, I knew one thing: this battle was far from over. The next few days were a blur of contemplation, tension, and planning. The lawyer's card sat on my nightstand, staring at me like a dare. I felt torn between two worlds, one that craved justice at any cost, and another that feared what that justice might destroy. My parents' betrayal had cut deep, but the idea of dragging them through legal action made me feel a pang of guilt I couldn't ignore. Yet, every time I thought about how they had dismissed me, stolen from me, and refused to acknowledge their wrongdoing, my resolve hardened. The tension in the house was unbearable. My parents barely spoke to me, and when they did, it was clipped and cold. Meanwhile, I kept digging for evidence. Late one night, while scrolling through old messages and receipts, I stumbled upon something that made my heart skip a beat. A bank transfer confirmation from 2 years ago. It was proof that the initial bulk of my savings had come from my paycheck, a clear record of my hard work. I took a screenshot and added it to my growing collection of evidence. The following morning, I decided to test the waters one last time before taking any drastic steps. Over breakfast, I brought up the refund again. My parents looked at me with thinly veiled irritation. "Why are you still harping on this?" my mother snapped, pushing her plate aside. "The money's gone. Move on." "It's not about the money," I said, though we all knew that wasn't entirely true. "It's about trust. You didn't even ask me. You just took what wasn't yours and acted like it was no big deal." My father set his coffee mug down with a loud thud. "You need to stop playing the victim. We're your parents. We've done more for you than you can imagine. That money wasn't just yours. It was part of this family's resources." "Then why didn't you include me in the trip?" I shot back, my voice rising. "If it was for the family, why was I left out?" My mother opened her mouth to respond but faltered, her expression betraying a flicker of guilt. My father, however, wasn't so easily rattled. "You're being selfish," he said flatly. "We've worked hard our whole lives to provide for you. The least you could do is show some gratitude." "Gratitude?" I repeated, laughing bitterly. "For what? For stealing from me? For freezing my account? For leaving me out of the one thing you claimed was for the family? If that's your idea of gratitude, then maybe you should rethink your definition." The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging in the air. My parents exchanged glances, but neither of them said anything. I took a deep breath, deciding it was time to lay my cards on the table. "I spoke to a lawyer," I said, my voice steady despite the nerves coursing through me. That got their attention. My mother's face went pale, and my father's jaw tightened. "A lawyer?" he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "Yes," I said firmly. "I wanted to know my options, and according to her, I have a strong case. That money was mine. You took it without my permission, and you've refused to return it. Legally, that's theft." My mother looked like she was about to cry, but my father leaned forward, his eyes blazing. "You would take your own parents to court?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "If that's what it takes to get my money back," I said, meeting his gaze. "Yes." The room was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. My mother finally spoke, her voice shaky. "You don't mean that." "I do," I said. "I'm done being treated like I don't matter. You had every opportunity to make this right, but you didn't. So now I have to protect myself." My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You're making a huge mistake," he said, storming out of the room. My mother stayed seated, her hands trembling as she reached for her coffee. "You don't know what you're doing," she said softly. "You're tearing this family apart." "No," I said, my voice firm. "You did that the moment you decided my dreams didn't matter." As I walked back to my room, I felt a strange mix of sadness and determination. This wasn't how I wanted things to be, but my parents had left me no choice. If they thought they could scare me into backing down, they were wrong. This battle was just beginning, and I was ready to see it through to the end. The house was eerily quiet the next morning. My father had left early for work, and my mother was holed up in her room, likely nursing her bruised pride. I should have felt triumphant, but instead, I felt a gnawing emptiness. Confronting them had been necessary, but it also felt like I had crossed a line I couldn't step back from. The words, "tearing this family apart," echoed in my mind, but every time doubt crept in, I reminded myself of the betrayal that had started it all. Later that afternoon, I received a text from an unfamiliar number. My stomach dropped as I opened it. "You're making a fool of yourself. This will ruin you. Stop before it's too late." The words sent a chill through me. My first thought was that it had to be my father, trying to intimidate me into backing down. But as I stared at the screen, I noticed something odd. The text had no identifying tone, no personal details. It felt colder, more calculated. I tried to shake it off, but a nagging unease lingered. I forwarded the message to Mia. "What do you think? My dad?" I asked. Her reply came almost immediately. "Possibly, but it could also be someone else. Maybe they've told someone else about the situation." The thought hadn't crossed my mind. My parents weren't exactly shy about venting their frustrations, but who would care enough to intervene? The idea that they might be rallying allies against me added a new layer of tension. That evening, I returned to the lawyer's office, determined to press forward. She greeted me with the same calm professionalism as before, but this time there was a slight edge to her tone. "I looked into your situation a bit more," she began, sliding a folder across the desk. "Legally, your parents don't have the right to take funds that belong solely to you. This is a strong case, especially since you have proof of deposits tied to your earnings." I nodded, trying to focus despite the whirlwind of emotions running through me. "So, what happens if I move forward?" "We'll file a formal complaint and request the return of your funds. If they refuse, we can escalate to court," she explained. "But you should be prepared for backlash. Cases like this, especially within families, can get messy." "I'm already in the middle of messy," I said with a sigh. "At this point, I just want to make things right." She gave me a reassuring smile. "Then we'll move forward. I'll draft the initial paperwork and send it over for your review." Walking out of her office, I felt lighter, like I was finally taking control of the situation. But my relief was short-lived. When I got home, my parents were waiting for me in the living room, their faces grim. "Sit down," my father said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I hesitated but complied, my heart pounding. My mother sat silently, her hands wringing in her lap. My father, on the other hand, leaned forward, his eyes fixed on me. "We've been talking," he began, his voice measured but laced with tension. "And we've decided to compromise." The word made me raise an eyebrow. Compromise? After everything they'd done, they wanted to negotiate? "We'll return some of the money," he continued. "Not all of it, but enough to show that we're willing to meet you halfway, but only if you agree to drop this nonsense about lawyers and court." I stared at him, trying to gauge his sincerity. The idea of getting some of my money back was tempting, but his terms felt like a trap. "How much is some?" I asked cautiously. "Half," my mother said quietly. "We'll give you half of what's left." Half. It was far less than what I was owed, but the look in my mother's eyes made me pause. There was a flicker of desperation there, a crack in her usually stoic demeanor. It was the first time I'd seen any hint of vulnerability from her since this whole ordeal began. "And if I don't agree?" I asked, my voice steady. My father's expression hardened. "Then you'll get nothing, and we'll make sure you regret it." The words hung in the air, a chilling ultimatum. For the first time, I realized just how far my parents were willing to go to protect themselves. They weren't just trying to avoid responsibility, they were trying to crush me. But I refused to let them win. "I'll think about it," I said, standing up. "But don't think for a second that you can intimidate me." As I walked back to my room, I could feel their eyes boring into my back. Their offer was a desperate attempt to regain control, but it also showed that they were afraid. And that, more than anything, gave me hope that I could still come out of this on top. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying their ultimatum, over and over in my mind. Half of the money. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't justice, but it was something, a lifeline to reclaim part of what I'd lost. But the way my father had delivered the offer, with that cold, hard edge in his voice, made me feel like agreeing would be surrendering. If I accepted, I'd be letting them dictate the terms of my own life yet again. The next morning, I called Mia. She listened quietly as I explained the situation, her silence heavy with concern. "I don't know, Mia," I said finally, rubbing my temples. "Half of the money is better than nothing. But what if taking it just proves to them that they can keep walking all over me?" "It's a tough call," she said, her voice thoughtful. "But I think you already know what you need to do." Her words stayed with me as I got ready to leave for work. I had made it this far, pushed them this hard. Walking away now felt like betraying myself. I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't offering a compromise out of goodwill. It was a way to silence me, to sweep the whole thing under the rug so they could go back to pretending nothing had happened. And that wasn't something I could live with. By the time I returned home that evening, my decision was made. My parents were waiting for me again, their expressions carefully neutral. My mother had made tea, the smell of chamomile filling the room in what felt like a feeble attempt to create a calm atmosphere. "Well?" my father asked as soon as I walked in. "What's your answer?" I sat down across from them, meeting his gaze head-on. "No," I said simply. My mother's lips parted in surprise, but my father's expression darkened immediately. "No? You're rejecting our offer?" "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "Because this isn't about the money anymore. It's about the fact that you took something that wasn't yours and acted like it didn't matter. Half of the money doesn't change that." "You're being unreasonable," my father snapped, his voice rising. "We're trying to make peace, and you're throwing it back in our faces." "Peace?" I repeated, laughing bitterly. "You mean control. That's all this has ever been about for you. Control. You're not offering me half to make things right. You're offering it so I'll shut up and stop fighting back." My mother looked on the verge of tears, but my father stood, his fists clenched. "You're going to regret this," he said through gritted teeth. "Maybe," I said, standing as well. "But at least I'll know I didn't back down." With that, I turned and walked away, leaving them speechless. For the first time, I felt a strange sense of freedom, as if the weight of their expectations had finally lifted from my shoulders. I knew they would fight back, and that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I was ready. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings. My lawyer filed a formal demand for the full return of my funds, and the evidence I had gathered left little room for doubt. My parents tried to fight it, accusing me of being ungrateful and vindictive, but the facts were on my side. When the final ruling came, I felt a mix of relief and vindication. The court ordered my parents to return the full amount of my savings, along with a formal acknowledgement of their wrongdoing. It wasn't the apology I had hoped for, but it was enough to close that chapter of my life. Our relationship was never the same after that. My parents and I spoke less and less, the distance between us growing with each passing year. It hurt, but it also felt necessary. Sometimes, standing up for yourself means letting go of the people who refuse to respect you. Looking back, I don't regret my decision. It wasn't just about the money. It was about reclaiming my autonomy, my dignity, and my voice. They had underestimated me, but in the end, I proved that I was stronger than they ever gave me credit for. And that, more than anything, made it all worth it.